I start with this interesting slide that refers to the most ferocious days of the military dictatorship in Brazil in the 1970s, when more than 1,000 articles were censored in one of Brazil's biggest newspapers, O Estado de São Paulo. Because the forbidden sections were not allowed to be left blank, they were regularly filled with cooking recipes and, more notably, with long sections of the 16th century epic poem, the Lúcia, by Portugal's foundational poet, Luís Vaz de Camões. And you can see 2 columns there being filled up with poetry by Camões, replacing censored news. These ersatz texts, though distant in time and space from the country's current troubles, were all the more political for the discrepancy they presented with the original, evidencing, as they did, the violent suppression of the truth. My feeling watching Tabu, by Miguel Gomes, is of a film with scores of blank pages filled up with playful ersatz where actual political statements should have been. In part 1 of the film, called A Lost Paradise, set in current-day Lisbon, we meet Aurora, a semi-senile lady given to gambling who was once a farmer in Africa. She lives alone with her Cape Verdean maid, Santa, next door to Pilar, a good Samaritan, who repeatedly comes to Aurora's succor. Part 2 of the film, called Paradise, is a flashback that should explain the blood in that Aurora claims to have in her hands, Pilar's unconditional devotion to Aurora, and Santa's hostility to both, but in particular to Pilar, despite the latter's kindness. Instead, all we get are tales of pet crocodiles and of love and adultery among Europeans in an undefined part of Africa. Even the more realist part 1 is littered with incoherent stories, for example, of a member of the TZ sect who turns out to be an ordinary Polish backpacker called Maya, who moreover denies to be herself and refuses to stay in Pilar's flat in Lisbon as previously agreed. The complete disregard to cause-effect relationship and narrative realism in the way these tales are told removes from them any semblance of veracity. And yet, this phony fantasy elicits a sense of foreboding, of an ominous truth lurking underground, whose form and content remain unknown, but whose historical reality is unequivocal: the violence of Portuguese colonialism in Africa. But why does the film adamantly refuse to call it by the name? Needless to say, there is no ban imposed on the subject, as in the example of the dictatorial censorship in Brazil in the 1970s, meaning that the film's foreclosure of history can only be deliberate. Whatever the case, the view that Tabu is a brilliant film is widespread and corroborated by the host of prizes and critical accolade it has collected from its launch in 2012. I too share the persuasion that the film is exquisitely crafted and enacted, but find it hard to pinpoint the reasons why I should actually like it. If the fictitious Mount Tabu, the central figuration in the African landscape in part 2, stands for the unspeakable crimes of colonialism, as all evidence indicates, then the tone of playful parody and irony adopted in the film's fragmentary storylines, combined with their systematic diversion towards trivial personal fabulations wherever a social issue is at stake, would verge on the frivolous. But then if the colonialism the film elliptically refers to is not any specific historical fact, but an atmosphere emanating from current-day Portugal, there might be a point in its wit and lightness of touch, as Sally Faulkner has defined it. In favor of this interpretation is the fact that auteur-director Miguel Gomes had never been to Africa before shooting Tabu. Hence his or his film's alleged inability to represent colonialism as lived experience, but only as atmosphere. In Tabu, states Gomes, there is this invented Africa which is based on a kind of fake memory of Africa, for which we can thank classical American cinema. And he goes on to add, my memory of Africa is Tarzan, is Hatari, is out of Africa. End of quote. At the same time, there is an equally notable effort in the film to ground all fiction in the real. Indexical realism is produced via traditional realist devices such as location shooting in Lisbon for part 1 and in Mozambique for part 2. The regular occurrence of non-professional acting, including most of the African cast. Improvisation resulting from the latter and also from other lead and supporting actors, as well as from the shooting crew who had to rewrite the script for lack of funds. The use of the long take in some key scenes is another realist devices, and the employment of documentary techniques, in particular as refers to the African rituals. Moreover, the deconstruction of narrative realism elicits not only anti-realism, but also its reverse, medium realism, most apparent in the film's cinephilic fabric, made of countless nods to other films, starting with Murnau's classic Tabu. I would go as far as seeing the use of the already obsolete 35mm gauge for part 1, set in present-day Portugal, and the archaic 16mm gauge for the African flashback in part 2 as another realist procedure, driving the film's visuals away from digital virtuality and back to the haptic materiality of the medium. In what follows, I will analyze these two structural but opposite movements within the film. On the one hand, the denial of history, and on the other, the grounding of the story in the real, with a view to identifying a possible truth procedure, as defined by Badiou, in the self-defeating fantasy they create. The film's first abrupt diversion from the subject of colonialism occurs right at the prologue, before part 1 is announced, and I'm going to show a clip to you. Loosely inspired in the life of 19th century Scottish explorer David Livingstone, who lost his wife to malaria in Africa, this initial tale is only palatable for being nonsensical, as otherwise it would be unacceptable to see a European explorer so innocently treated as he goes about subjecting the African population at will, calling them cannibals and comparing them to ferocious beasts. Needless to say, this story is there to be discredited, and so is the voiceover commentary uttered by director Gomes himself in an obvious parody of official discourses from the colonial times. Self-derision is further enhanced by the music track, a piano version of the bossa nova classic Insensatez by Tom Jobim and Vinícius de Moraes, played by Joana Sá, whose parodic aim is expressed in its own title, Variações Pindéricas sobre Insensatez, or in a loose translation, Trashy Variations on Insensatez. It flourishes in the manner of cheap piano bar music, distort and banalize the original, whilst the explorer's broken heart could be read as an echo to the song's lyrics, for those who know it, who have heard it, in which a heartbroken man talks to his own foolish heart. As Ferreira reminds us, such strategies of self-reflexivity and anti-illusionism could easily be described in the tradition of Brecht as alienating, or in the tradition of the essay film as trying to activate the spectators in order to make them evaluate the characters and the issues at stake. But this would be only half of the story. The other half, I suggest, is that the film seems rather content with the black hole at its core. As Carvalho puts it, Tabu asks us to think without telling us what to think. And he resorts to Lacan's objet petit a in order to explain and justify its ersatz state. The fundamental lack he identifies in it is, in his words, and I quote, the residue of what Lacan calls the real, that part of the real which exceeds our narcissistic perception of reality, that residue, that otherness which signifies a lack in our perception of the world, end of quote. Along the same lines, Faulkner identifies something unrepresentable in the untold backstory of Tabu's characters. And indeed, there would be scope to invoke apropos of the film Emmanuel Levinas's defense of and respect for what he calls the infinite alterity of the other, an ethics that would justify the turning the focus away from the immensurable plight lived by the victims of colonialism and towards an interrogation of the self. On the other hand, and in tune with the director's avowed lack of experience in Africa and consequently of the colonial atrocities, the protagonists in Tabu are all women, Pilar, Aurora, and Santa, all of whom had purportedly been kept away from and misinformed about the wars waged by their male counterparts. The only man in part one interacting with these female characters is Pilar's old painter friend, who explains to her that he was discharged from the war effort in Africa in his youth because of his varicose veins, a disease far more common in women than men. As much as Pilar, who rolls her eyes at this explanation, the spectator would take this as yet another, or should take this as yet another of the film's infamous detours, which ends with this duel by the painter. We've lost a soldier and won an artist. Given the dubious quality as well as sinister appearance of the painter's work shown in the film, it turns out to be yet another ersatz for some unexplained historical guilt. Here's the painting that we see in the film. So the dubious quality of it stands for some other unexplained story behind it. In part two, the character's lack of direct experience of the war is again referred to, this time by Ventura's voiceover narration, which recounts that he and Aurora met in secret while the others played their wars. Aproveitávamos os momentos em que os outros brincavam as guerras para furtivos encontros. Thus justifying the film's recurrent diversions from the subject of colonialism. However, if the blank pages covered with ersatz stories is the path chosen by Miguel Gomes, this is certainly not the only one available for those filmmakers lacking in direct experience of history. For example, a film such as Margarida Cardoso's The Murmuring Coast, A Costa dos Murmúrios, which bears a number of interesting parallels with Tabu, partakes of an entirely different view. Here, the gruesome history of colonialism is knowable and representable, even if the point of view is provided by women who had no direct experience of it. In a similar way, as in part two of Tabu, in the Murmuring Coast, the Portuguese women in colonial Africa are left behind in utter idleness, locked up in their houses or hotels, while their husbands are busy crushing independence movements in the hinterlands. Their ignorance of the goings-on is maintained by force through mendacious radio broadcasts and printed news, fabricated reports from the front conveyed by the military authorities, and more effectively by physical violence on the part of their husbands. However, Evita, the heroine married to the more liberal second lieutenant Luis, embarks in his absence on an investigative journey that culminates with her discovering a photograph of Luis holding the severed head of a black rebel at the end of a stake, as we can see here. Vieira, drawing on Sabine and others, enlightens us that this photograph is in fact the superimposed figure of the actor on what is a real photograph from the Portuguese colonial wars. Margarida Cardoso explained to us during that conversation we had that the impaled head is part of the picture, and she made a photo montage by imposing the figure of the actor on the picture. But even the unknowing spectator will feel the impact of an indexical climax provided by this picture, which fills the gap in fiction with the piercing burden of documentary truth. Nothing as explicit as that is to be found in Tabu. However, the film's insistence on locating the characters in real time and space, in particular in part 1, should at least partially account for the revelatory power critics almost unanimously seem to recognize in it. A suggestive example is the scene in which Aurora is introduced to the spectator, and I'm going to show a second clip to you. So, as you have seen, Aurora has gambled her last penny in a casino, and before that, she phones Santa at home to come to her rescue. Santa appeals to her neighbor Pilar, who has a car and drives her to the casino, as we had seen. So this is Pilar arriving with Santa at the casino. Their arrival by car at the Casino Estoril, the biggest in Europe, 18 kilometers away from Lisbon, is recorded with documentary precision. Santa stays in the car while Pilar joins Aurora for tea at a table placed on a rotating platform, which is also a real feature of Lounge D, one of the cafes in the Estoril. In a riveting performance, I got a picture of the real Estoril here, where you can see the rotating platform on the left-hand side there with the tables on top. So he just used that feature of the real casino. In a riveting performance, Laura Sandoval, in the skin of Aurora, tells Pilar about a dream that made her try her luck yet again at the casino. Captured mostly in one single long take. There is one reverse shot at the beginning, and then it's just one single long take of 3 minutes. A procedure that, since Bazin has been deemed the realistic device par excellence, Aurora's nonsensical simian fantasy gives flesh and bone to her prejudices against Africans, and Santa in particular, who she believes is plotting her death. The scene is also Hollywood back to front, in that the sliding backdrop behind Aurora and Pilar grounds in the reality of the casino the mechanism of the rear projection, a trick employed in the old days of American cinema to simulate movement in standstill, and whose clumsy artificiality is so outspoken that Laura Mulvey once described it as smuggling something of modernity into the classical form. Here, instead, it is the classical fantasy that is smuggled into the modern realist procedure of the long take, and deconstructed through its superimposition onto reality, in a way that could be compared to the photo montage of the body of an actor on a real scene of atrocity in Africa, as we have seen in the film by Margarida Cardoso. Here, however, what the characters are trying to do is to tame reality by means of fantasy, as can be didactically seen in part 2, when Aurora and her lover Gianluca, a pun with Jean-Luc Godard, play at finding animal shapes in the clouds of Africa. And sketches of these animals are superimposed on the clouds, these being suggestively a monkey, a crocodile, and a lamb. Whilst monkeys and crocodiles are the characters' favorite pets in Africa, and the symbol of their domineering drive, The clouds refuse to fit entirely into the superimposed drawings, as much as Africa will forever refuse to fit into the colonizers and the film's idea of it. Santa's plotting the death of her boss behind her back is another of Aurora's clumsy attempt at applying her fantasies onto reality, this time fueled by the fumes emanating from Santa's nocturnal activities, described by Aurora as macumba, witchcraft. The realist translation of this persecutory fantasy is, however, presented to us in the form of Santa having a cigarette after a meal and reading Robinson Crusoe in a juvenile edition in order to improve her literacy in the language of the former colonizers. The scene closes with a revelatory still life composition that you can see here, comprising the shells from the prawns she has just eaten, the book Robinson Crusoe, and a pack of Agia cigarettes, complete with the label "Smoking Kills," Fumar Mata, implying that if Santa is risking the life of anyone, it is only her own. One could speak of a structural fear in the film that places its core subject under prohibition or taboo. But this could also be theorized in terms of a courage to face the void, the unknown, the nothingness that nauseated Sartre's characters. Elaborating on Heidegger's phenomenology, Sartre states in his magnum opus, Being and Nothingness, that even if unknowable, nothingness can be understood. There exist numerous attitudes of human reality that imply a comprehension of nothingness: hate, prohibitions, regret, etc. For Dasein, he's dialoguing with Heidegger's notion of Dasein, there is even the possibility of finding oneself face to face with nothingness and discovering it as a phenomenon. This possibility is anguish. It is a mixture of hate, prohibitions, regret, and anguish that form the atmosphere of Tabu, as they emanate from characters faced with a void they cannot name or explain, except through fantasy. On the level of the fable, this void is simply guilt. On the level of the film as medium, however, it is the unexpected encounter with a truth that presents itself within representation. Let me explain by resorting to Badiou's regime of truths, which is governed by the notion of event. To be faithful to an event, he says, is to move within the situation that this event has supplemented by thinking the situation according to the event. Such notions of event and situation chime with my approach in that they acknowledge the precedence of presentation over representation, insofar as the latter can only occur once all multiple singularities are presented at the same time within the situation, constituting a state in the Marxist sense, as well as in the common sense of status quo. For its representational character, the situation is thus endowed with a normative element which does not hold any truth in itself. A truth, says Badiou, is solely constituted by rupturing with the order which supports it, never as an effect of that order, that is to say, by the emergence of the unpredictable event. The ethical subject, in turn, is characterized by an active fidelity to the event of truth. It thus bears an intentionality regulated by the uncertain and the unexpected, which creates the need for a choice. And I quote, the same choice that divides the courage of truths from nihilism. The militant utopian tone of Badiou's statement reverberates throughout Tabu. Beyond any particular political orientation it may embrace, the film is actively committed to the truth of the pro-filmic event, that part that cannot and will not be controlled by the cinematic apparatus or by pre-existing cinephilia or by any a priori knowledge on the part of the filmmaker. Just think of the ritual performed by a group of musicians and dancers that you have seen at the very beginning, after the death of the so-called explorer. Edited as if the performers were reacting to his death, in mourning or celebration, this documentary scene, shot in the manner of ethnographic footage, with details of the beating hands and stamping feet, is flagrantly disconnected from whatever fiction preceded it. Beyond any parody, these men and women, performing solely for the sake of the camera and not of the fiction, reveal themselves as totally unknowable others, hence as an event of truth that smashes the legend of the Portuguese explorer sacrificing himself for love. In conclusion, I would say that in Tabu, all is laughable, but there is no reason to laugh, given the enormity of the task it places in front of our eyes. Thousands of blank pages to be filled out, not with our imagination, but with historical truth. Thank you very much.